If there's one thing that truly sticks with me, well beyond my time with a great video game, more than gripping storylines or immersive gameplay or cathartic character arcs, it's the soundtrack. Those melodies that burrow deep in my subconscious while I'm performing surgery, digging up Chaos Emeralds, or chilling with Winnie the Pooh, all culminate in a lasting fondness for not just the game itself, but the time in my life that I played it. I'm immediately transported back to my 9-year-old self summer vacation whenever I hear the AC/DC Town theme from the Battle Network series, or the autumn of 2002 whenever I hear the Traverse Town theme from the first Kingdom Hearts. And just going by the sheer breadth of playlists, vinyl pressings, and sold-out orchestra concerts I've seen over the past couple of years, I don't think I'm alone in this. But beyond that, video game soundtracks are responsible for turning me on to entire genres of music I'd have probably never gone out of my way to listen to. As a kid, I was convinced The Pillows and Linkin Park were it. Like, pack it up boys, we're going home. It doesn't get better than this. But I credit video games for breaking me out of that mentality, exposing me from a young age to stuff like lo-fi hip-hop, acid techno, funk, classical, heck, even straight-up pop at a time when I thought I was too cool to listen to pop music, providing the scaffolding for me to seek out bands and artists I might have never been able to appreciate without these well-crafted introductions. Despite that exposure, there's one genre I've come to love over the years that I notice doesn't appear nearly as much in video game music as other equally obscure genres, and that's shoegaze. Maybe obscure isn't necessarily accurate, since there seems to be a sizable portion of Gen Z kind of reviving the genre online, but when it comes to its appearance in video games, shoegaze is most definitely obscure, if not borderline absent altogether. For a quick rundown, shoegaze is a genre of music that gained prominence in the late 80s, early 90s as a way to describe bands whose music paired heavy distortion and other guitar effects with dreamy, almost incoherent vocals to create a particularly ethereal atmosphere of sounds. The kind of music that sounds like if you converted its audio into an image, it would look something like this. Since these bands' guitarists spent a lot of time during performances gazing down at their shoes to switch between their effects pedals, a British music critic coined the term shoegazers to describe them. A somewhat complicated part of finding examples for this video was the fact that shoegaze is a term that's often hard to rigidly define, even among the most diehard fans in the scene. Ironically, not unlike some gaming communities. A big part of this is because the qualities typically used to define shoegaze overlap heavily with genres like noise rock and dream pop, making the line between the three often very blurry and subjective. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to try and point to examples in video games that are at the very least arguable to most fans of the genre. So, going in chronological order, the first example I was able to find was Electronic Arts racing opus Road Rash on the 3DO. While Road Rash actually saw a release on multiple platforms, the 1994 3DO version is considered the most definitive edition, both for its graphical capabilities for the time, and for the fact that the 3DO's CD format allowed the game to use full motion video cutscenes, and, more relevant to this video's topic, licensed music in its soundtrack. Among the bands featured on Road Rash's soundtrack was the English group Swervedriver, who provided 2 tracks off their 1993 album Mexelhead, Duel and Last Train to Satansville. Now, if we're being super technical, Swervedriver didn't really consider themselves shoegaze at this time. That would be applied to them retroactively, but this is also true of many bands from this era that would later go on to be included under the shoegaze umbrella. I personally feel that Duel's chorus makes it qualify under the definition of shoegaze I'm working with, so I'm choosing to include it, but feel free to disagree with me in the comments if it really bothers you. Duel would actually make another appearance 13 years later on PS3's Burnout Paradise, which was essentially a spiritual successor to the Road Rash series, with the song's inclusion in Burnout Paradise serving as an homage to this original version. In Road Rash, these Swervedriver tracks would play during the aforementioned FMV cutscenes, which shows the player's character accepting their prize for coming in first while a crowd of bikers cheered them on. Definitely a bit dated by today's standards, but a fun means of incorporating what was new technology at the time, and probably pretty sick to have been a fan of some of these bands and hear their music faithfully featured in a video game. Swervedriver was an especially clever group to include, given their aesthetic in this era borrowed heavily from retro American car culture. Probably as fitting as one can get for a racing game. Next on the list, we have 1997's Moon Remix RPG adventure for the PlayStation, a quirky anti-RPG that was actually developed by a group of former Square employees. Unlike probably most other RPGs in these days, Moon allowed players to collect Moondiscs throughout the game, which granted you the ability to change the game's background music to licensed songs written by a number of independent Japanese artists. Among these contributions was Japanese pop shoegaze band The Sleepwalk, whose song Warp Wet Woods is a triumph in both video game music and shoegaze. What starts as a trippy electronic jaunt quickly gives way to a bona fide shoegaze jam, complete with dreamy, lyricless vocals and a swelling production that culminates in the most satisfying blanket of guitars and fuzz. It ought to be illegal to listen to this one sans headphones. Speaking of satisfying guitar and fuzz, our next example comes from none other than the horror masterpiece itself, Silent Hill 2, where an otherwise ambient trip-hop soundtrack is treated to select moments of what I would call, at least tangentially shoegaze. Those crashing, depressive power chords punctuating the major sections of Laura's theme feel like they were born out of the darker edge of the shoegaze pool, while Overdose Delusion opens immediately into a hypnotic riff that lurks beneath the lead guitar for almost the entirety of the song, building a wall of guitars that captures all the tension and sorrow of the game's story in a way that only a genius like Akira Yamaoka can pull off. I even feel like End of Small Sanctuary from Silent Hill 3 deserves a mention here for how it mirrors the instrumental overlaps of Overdose Delusion, albeit with a distinctly gloomier spirit than its predecessor. A distinction that's really no mystery to anyone who's experienced both of these games. Jumping a bit ahead, we have a song by Scottish indie rock band The Twilight Sad making an appearance on Saints Row 2's soundtrack, of all places, with their song And She Would Darken the Memory. According to the game's wiki, there are over 170 licensed songs from a pretty diverse range of artists that can be played over the in-game radio stations, so this one likely found its way in through a package deal between the band's label and the game's sound division, but regardless, it meets our criteria for this list. This one definitely spreads its shoegaze wings closer to its finale, but those last 2 minutes are absolutely consumed by guitars blaring over one another, filling every pocket of sound right up to the end. Next up, we have the soundtrack from 2015's first-person stealth game Neon Struct, whose soundtrack features music by the Dallas native electronic indie group The Home Conversion. While definitely situated comfortably between shoegaze and electro-pop, songs like I Love HK and Night Terror deserve a place here. Whenever I listen to I Love HK, I think of the Roadhouse performances in Twin Peaks' third season. It just has the aura that a lot of those bands were bringing that I can't quite put words to. If any of you remember that band, the Chromatics, that plays at the end of the first 2 episodes, that's kind of what I mean. It's got swelling synths, transcendent vocals, and distortion so dirty it practically insists on being played at max volume. You'll want to wake the neighbors with this one, and I mean that in the absolute best way possible. The Home Conversion was also just a perfect match for Neon Struct's aesthetic, to the point where I'd believe it if I was told the game's appearance was purposefully built around the sound of their music. Its overall color scheme is in the exact realm you'd picture in your head when listening to their songs. Seriously, do yourself a favor and check them out if you're even remotely a fan of electronic pop or shoegaze. You won't be disappointed. Our next example brings us to yet another game that boasts an extensive and diverse catalog of licensed music, FIFA 18, where none other than shoegaze pioneers Slowdive make an appearance with their song Star Roving. This one, I'll admit, was something of an inspiration for this video, as I was so surprised to see shoegaze pop up in such a random game that it made me want to look into other places I might find the genre across the medium. Though, thinking on it now, Is it really all that surprising that among the millions of people that appreciate soccer, there would be an overlap between fans of FIFA and shoegaze? Not really. At least, not enough that it'd be inconceivable for someone to toss in a legendary group like Slowdive to appeal to that sliver of FIFA's audience. But, who knows? Maybe someone on the game staff is just that much of a true believer and us shoegazers happen to get lucky. Either way, I'm certainly not complaining. Nearing the end of our list, we have the soundtrack to Minikui Mojika no Ko, a visual novel/adventure game where you take the role of a high schooler who faces severe bullying due to his appearance, complicated by the fact that he's able to read people's minds by looking at their face. As a result, most of the gameplay involves you staring at the main character's feet to avoid reading the awful things others think about him. The plot, much like many visual novels, has numerous branching paths where the main character takes revenge on his bullies. Unfortunately, outside of staring at his feet, the other half of the gameplay involves depictions of his revenge, which are often very disturbing in nature and involve a non-insignificant amount of sexually explicit stuff. And, given YouTube's guidelines, I kind of have to leave it at that. The reason I mention it here is because the soundtrack features music by Ayumi Kobayashi, a member of the Japanese indie rock/shoegaze group Spool. One of the ending themes credited to Ayumi, titled Ku, is a bleak shoegaze number that fits perfectly with the heavier elements of the game's story, and would be a shame to overlook on a list like this. Ayumi clearly wasn't shy about bringing her toolkit from her time in Spool for her work on this soundtrack, and it's especially apparent in this song. At a total run of 6.5 minutes, Ku takes its time to put you in a very particular headspace, only breaking out of its droning instrumentation for the last 2 minutes of the piece. But Kobayashi clearly knows what she's doing, as it never feels like we're vamping on a section for too long, resulting in a piece that feels like a lullaby for someone slipping into a long, sad dream. If you've ever been partial to the side of shoegaze occupied by groups like Have a Nice Life, you definitely want to give this one a listen. And finally, last on my list comes a song by Sacramento natives Soft Science, whose song Nothing is featured in the opening of the Australian indie visual novel Necrobarista. This one I have to especially give props for being basically the only instance I was able to find where the shoegaze track was placed front and center, rather than buried elsewhere in the OST. I really like how the tension builds in this song, with vocalist Katie Haley's performance pulling everything together as the latter half of the song finally kicks off. Soft Science brings a lot of beach house meets early Japanese breakfast energy with this one, with an extra tinge of ominousness thrown in. Definitely the right mood for a game titled Necrobarista. Before I end this off, I did want to include a few honorable mentions as well, for cases that aren't necessarily shoegaze themselves, but pay their respects to the genre all the same. So, in No More Heroes 2 on the Wii, during the boss fight with Captain Vladimir, a song by techno rock unit Hondalady plays, titled Shoegazer Watch the Stars. Listening to it, the song really doesn't contain any elements that you could deem shoegaze. It's pretty squarely in the realm of techno rock, so why mention the genre in the song title if it's not even the genre of the song itself? Well, this particular boss battle takes place with a Russian cosmonaut who's lost all sense of reality after being left by his people to drift in the cold, endless expanse of outer space. So, it fits in the context of the fight itself, but shoegaze as a genre has also been described as outer spacey, and I'm almost certain that seasoned musicians like Hondalady would be aware of that descriptor often associated with shoegaze. So, is it the genre itself appearing in a video game? No, but it is the idea of it, and that's gotta be worth something, I think. The next honorable mention goes to the battle theme from Shin Megami Tensei 5. Now, this one I really debated just including in the main list, but it ultimately feels like it resides closer to the noise end of the Venn diagram, so I opted to keep it here instead. This song is especially awesome because its best version is actually the version that plays in-game, not on the soundtrack. The reason for this is because the devs for SMT5 programmed battles to begin on dissonant guitar feedback, playing the battle theme only after the player or enemy actually attack. It makes those first few seconds feel extremely tense as you plan out whether you want to fight or run from the encounter, and adds a whole extra punch to the first hit when the song kicks in at full blast, driving home the idea that there's no going back once someone takes that first swing. And at least for my tastes, that first hit doesn't land as hard without the tense feedback that leads into it. But man, is it a first swing. Once the song starts, we're immediately struck by a storm of guitars, punctured only by the heavy hits of ATLUS's literal fire-breathing studio drummer. And while it's not one I'd immediately classify as shoegaze, I think if you're a fan of the genre and any of its neighboring soundscapes, and you hear this one, you'll feel a bit like someone out there at ATLUS gets it. And finally, I'd be remiss if I went through an entire video on shoegaze in video games and didn't point out the most obvious and famous nod of all time, the Loveless poster in Final Fantasy VII. Loveless being a reference to the 1991 album by My Bloody Valentine, which is often credited with defining and solidifying shoegaze as a genre all its own, serving as a sort of watershed moment for the scene, giving people a clear-cut example to point to when discussing the genre from then on. I especially wanted to mention it because, while it was originally just a random reference to a band the original developers were fond of, the iconic Loveless poster has grown from being a random Easter egg to an actual production in the lore of Final Fantasy VII, with Rebirth literally giving it a stage production and everything. And while the play doesn't have anything to do with My Bloody Valentine or the album itself, it's still wild to think that a throwaway nod to a shoegaze band from the early 90s is still getting screen space in the remakes all the same. All because some level designer was really digging them some My Bloody Valentine back in the early 90s. And while we don't get to hear anything from this masterpiece of an album in either the original or remakes of FF7, this one is still probably the best and most enduring example of shoegaze in video games one can find. So, that's everything I was able to dig up. Like I said, it was fairly difficult to find examples, even with extensive digging and asking around community spaces. Ironically enough, there's no shortage of shoegaze bands covering video game music, indicating that there's a considerable overlap between fans of the genre and video games. But, unfortunately, not as much can be said of the reverse. But hey, maybe as shoegaze continues to trend among younger audiences, more game studios will pay attention and offer more of it in their soundtracks. Feel free to drop any examples from video games I might have missed in the comments. I'd love to continue building on this list and maybe make an updated version of this video in the future. Until next time.